Hello, everyone. On today's podcast episode, I'm gonna continue off where I left off on like 2 episodes ago. I think episode 35. I talked about atheists and why being an atheist is illogical. On this podcast episode, I'm gonna continue from that. Then give you another reason why, when an atheist, two podcast episodes ago, I talked about when an atheist, because of how God created the world. When an atheist opens his mouth, right, he inadvertently proves that that God exists. You think I'm lying, right? When I say that, you think I'm lying. That when an atheist opens his mouth to prove that God doesn't exist, he automatically inadvertently proves that God exists instead. He doesn't know what he's doing, but that's exactly what he's doing. Do you know why? Because you should probably go back to listen to episode 35, right? Where I talked about it being illogical, being completely impossible for someone to logically become an atheist. And yes, it's true. It is completely impossible for someone to be an atheist by using logic, using proofs. So the only way for someone to be an atheist is through illogical means. And here's one of the illogical conclusions that atheists conclude why they're atheists. When you ask an atheist, why are you an atheist? You know what it'll tell you? Humans were born atheists. That's what it'll tell you. Humans are born atheists and then they become theists. Do you believe that? The thing with science is, if you notice the debates between theists and atheists never really bring out an argument. All they do is wait for theists to bring out an argument so they can mock and insult them for being wrong. But if you stand down and ask an atheist, okay, now prove that God doesn't exist, they'll just look at you funny. Or they'll mock you for asking them to prove that God doesn't exist. They'll say it is an atheist, it is a problem for atheists to prove that God exists because they were born atheists. But the truth is, are you really born atheist? Are we supposed to just accept, because you say, all humans are born atheists, are we really supposed to just accept that, argument as the truth? Look at you. If the human race were born atheists, right? Everyone would be atheist by default. There will not be a single religion here in this world. If an atheist tells you you were born atheist and then you became a theist, it's like them telling you that you were born tall and then, you end up growing up short. Or you were born black and you ended up growing up white. If you were born, they see a baby and they say the baby was supposed to be born tall, but strangely, ended up being born white. If we were born to be atheists, why are we all theists then? There was a study that I read, in the past. You can find it online. That every population of humans, right? Every little population of humans, no matter how isolated they are actually theists. They all have a belief in a higher power. Every single last one of us. That means we were born by default. If us going, if we grow up, being theists, right? It automatically means we were born to be theists. If someone grows up, and becomes 5 foot tall, it means we're supposed to be born, when he was born, he was destined to be 5 foot tall. If someone, someone grows up and becomes 6 foot tall, it means he was born to be 6 foot tall. If someone grows up and becomes a theist, it means he was born to be a theist. And they'll say, with this argument, people, the scientists, an atheist would tell me, it's coincidence. It's a coincidence that the whole world are all theists. Do you really believe that life is all, that it's a coincidence that the entire world are theists and there's only a few atheists? And the fact that, the very act of being an atheist, it's an illogical conclusion. It's impossible to logically become an atheist. If you don't believe me, listen to my last podcast episode 35, where I go into details on it. So if it's logically impossible to be an atheist, right? And everyone in this world is born a theist from birth. You say, no, it's not. It's not. We're all atheists. But you have to prove it. And yet the world itself, you have to prove. You can't just make a statement that we're all born atheists. Or we're all born, non-theists or non-atheists at birth. And then we became theists, as we grew up. That's not logical, because if that was true, everyone right now would not be a theist. The entire world filled with religion would not exist if humans weren't born inclined to be, religious to begin with. If humans weren't born with the ability to see, we would not be able to see. If humans weren't born with the ability to breathe, we would not be able to breathe. If humans weren't born with the ability to believe in God, we will not believe in God. It's a basic fact. So them opening their mouth to say we were born to be atheists, it's a lie. They have to prove that we were born to be atheists. And it's impossible, because the entire world is filled with what? Religious people. So the very fact that the whole world is covered in religious people proves to that, it automatically disproves the fact that we were born to be atheists. If we were born to be atheists, we will grow up as atheists. Not a single religion will be in sight. So the only reason why there's religion in this world is that what? We were born to be religious people at birth. Just like we were born to be, some people were born to be tall, some people were born to be short. We were all born to be religious people at birth. That's the only logical conclusion why we are. You can't say we were born to be atheists. Then how did we become theists then? If the whole world was born to be tall, 5 foot tall, then how are some people 4 foot tall, and some people are 6 foot, and some people are only 2 feet tall? It makes no logical conclusion to say it's coincidence that we're all atheists. That we're all theists. We're all born to be atheists. When we're at birth, we were born atheists, and then at some point in time, we just became, theists. It's illogical to say that's a coincidence. It's like saying, the earth rotates around the sun by coincidence. The earth is round by coincidence. Language came by coincidence. You get hungry by coincidence. When you're hungry, you look for something to eat by coincidence. If you don't understand why something happened, do not just assume it's by coincidence. If an atheist, and that's one of the reasons why it's, debating an atheist is an illogical choice for you to make. Why? An atheist did not become an atheist, like I said in the previous episode that I mentioned before. An atheist is not an atheist by logical choice. Since they didn't come to that, conclusion by logical choice, because it is impossible to come to that conclusion by logical choice, it means they are illogical people. And since they're illogical people, they will always bring out illogical arguments. Their logic will always have a flaw that they can't see. They're incapable of realizing the logic has a flaw because they're illogical by birth, or not by birth. I'm not gonna shame them that they're all illogical retards. They're not. But the conclusion that they're atheists, which is not true, because it's impossible to be an atheist unless you choose that conclusion illogically. If that conclusion is chosen that's the only way you can be an atheist, because they're so illogical. Nothing you say to them will make any logical sense to them, because they didn't become atheists using logic. They did not become atheists using logic, and none of their points make any logical sense. So every time they open their mouth, they inadvertently convert people into theists by and it's not only converting them, it's more like pushing them away from their atheism, Because when atheists open their mouth and nothing they say makes logical sense, it's hard for you to, believe that what they're saying is true. If it's, if they open their mouth and nothing they say makes logical sense, why should you believe them? And that's the problem with atheism. If you want to play with atheism, just know you're not playing, you're not dealing with logical people, because they did not become atheists using logic. That's why they automatically illogically assume that humans that are driven to be theists at birth are somehow born atheists and randomly ended up being theists. It's just coincidence that we just ended up being, the entire human race filled with religious people. It's just coincidence that we became that. We just coincidentally became religious people. We were born atheists and we just coincidentally became religious people. If that was the truth, it's like saying, everyone was born short, 2 feet tall, and it's just coincidence that most of us are 5 foot tall. It is just coincidence. Does that make any logical sense to you? That, we were born 2 feet tall, but it's just coincidence that most of us are like between 4 feet to 5'9". It is just coincidence. That's the logic science these atheists are telling you. They're gaslighting you into somehow believing them. They gaslight you into thinking you were born an atheist when you're not, because the very act of being an atheist is an illogical choice. So how are you born, thinking that you're an atheist when being an atheist by default is an illogical choice to make? So how can you be born with, your brain being that illogical when humans are one of the most intelligent species on the planet? So how are you born with an illogical brain that automatically believes that God doesn't exist? When just the fact that you believe that God doesn't exist, right, is an illogical choice to make in life. You do not, you can't believe that God doesn't exist because you can't prove that God doesn't exist. If you can't prove that God doesn't exist, if you believe that God doesn't exist, you only believe it by an illogical choice. You chose that choice by faith alone. There's no proof. There's no proof that God doesn't exist. If there's no proof that God doesn't exist, and you choose to believe that God doesn't exist, it means you're making a leap of faith. You're illogically accepting that God doesn't exist without proof whatsoever. You understand? So no one was born an atheist at birth. They illogically decided to be an atheist because whatever reason, whatever illogical reason that, came about in their lives. And most of them may not even be atheists. There are people that, who pretend to be atheists when the truth is they just hate religion. Because they just hate religion, they just, they claim themselves to be atheists without really realizing what the word atheist actually means. If you ask some of these atheists, they may never tell you, they may never be able to tell you the definition of what an atheist is. They may not even be able to know, accurately tell you that, an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God. They just know that they don't like religion, and that's it. It doesn't mean they don't believe in God. It just means they don't like religion. They don't like Christianity. Or they don't like Muslims. Or they don't like, Islam. They don't like, the Jewish religion. They don't like, Buddhism. They don't like this. They don't like that. It's not that they don't believe in God. It's just that they don't like X or Y. And that's the problem with atheism. They're incapable of realizing that their very choice of being atheist is an illogical choice because they made that choice illogically. And trying to convince an illogical person using logic is practically impossible because they didn't make that choice using logic to begin with. So they didn't make that choice using logic to begin with, but emotions and feelings, They found a celebrity that called himself an atheist. Now they want to be like that celebrity, so they're an atheist. They found, they found a scientist, a renowned scientist who wants to call himself an atheist. Now everybody around them who likes him, who reveres him, who respects him, wants to be an atheist just like him. They're too afraid of him not liking them for being theists, so they pretend to be atheists around him, and then behind his back, they're reading Bibles and doing this, and then in front of them they call themselves atheists. So this is what you have to watch out for. The world of atheists isn't really something that a theist can understand. And they will always make up these, random claims without proof that yes, we're all born atheists, we're all born atheists. They have no proof for it. They have no proof. They've done no experiments. The experiments that we've seen, that I've seen, actually does the opposite. It actually proves that everyone in this world is actually born theists. Because every single group of people, no matter how isolated they are, have an inherent belief in a higher power. Every single last one of us. So if all of us have an inherent belief in a higher power, in a deity of sort, doesn't that automatically means we were born theists by birth? So that the very fact that, most people in this world believe in some sort of higher power, doesn't that automatically means that, we were theists by birth? It isn't a choice. We didn't make a choice. Just like we didn't make a choice, on breathing in oxygen, on what foods, we like. For example, sugar will always taste sweet in most people's mouth. It wasn't there by accident. When you breathe in air, you don't die from it. It wasn't there by accident. If you breathe in oxygen, you don't die from it. It wasn't there by accident. You're a theist by birth. It wasn't there by accident. There's a reason why you're a theist. There's a reason why most most of the people in this world are theists. If an atheist gaslights you, tricks you into thinking you were born an atheist, that's on you. They can lie all day that you were born an atheist. But if you were born an atheist, then why are you a theist now? Why is the majority of the world theist now? It's like saying, like I said before, it's like saying you were born short, but then somehow everyone grew up tall. Does that make any logical sense? That you were born short. The atheist claims that you were born short. You just somehow end up growing up taller than 2 feet tall. The majority of the human race just somehow strangely decided to just grow up 2 feet taller than we're supposed to be. Grow up taller than 2 feet tall. The atheist claims that you're born 2 feet. You're born to be 2 feet tall, but somehow strangely, most of the human race is around between 4 feet and 5. So, who's lying to you? Is biology lying to you, or is the atheist lying to you? You have to pick one. If the atheist claims that we're born to be atheists, right? But yet most of the people in this world are theists, then who do you think is lying to you, biology or the atheist? Because obviously life itself contradicts that claim. The very existence of the fact that most of us are either Christians, Muslims, or Jews, or what do you call Catholics. Even if, and this is the majority of religions right there. This is the largest religions out there, and then there's Buddhists, there's Jainists, and then there's the rest, and this is the majority of the population. Where else, where are all the atheists? If we're all born to be atheists, where are the atheists? How come everyone is a theist? How come everyone is a theist if we were born atheists? It makes no logical sense. If we were born to be short, why are we tall, Mr. Atheist? If you keep claiming that we're born to be short, why are we tall then? Oh, it's coincidence. That's what they'll tell you. It's coincidence. So you have to, you really have to understand that nothing an atheist says makes logical sense. If you keep listening to atheists thinking they'll ever give you any logical reasons why they're atheists, you run around in circles. You will never find a logical reason why someone is an atheist. It will always be a logical flaw. You may not be able to spot the flaw, but the flaw will still be there. Nothing they say makes any logical sense. That's why the only thing an atheist can do in a debate between an atheist and a theist is mock and insult the theist. Is try to point out the flaws in the logic of the theist and try to insult them. Because if you ask an atheist, bring out a reason why you're an atheist, they're incapable of doing that. So the only thing they can do is mock and insult you. They'll try to gaslight you with illogical arguments constantly. And then when you bring out logical arguments, they will try to insult you or downplay it. That's the only thing they can do. It's either downplay your logical arguments or insult you. Nothing else. So this is what you have to watch out for. If you ever want to be around theists, not to mention some atheists, right, have spent their entire lives, and this is what you need to be cautious of. Some atheists have spent their entire lives, yelling and screaming to everyone, telling everybody they're atheists, right? Because there's no proof that God exists, right? So if you ever come up with proof that God exists, what do you think it'll make them look like? It'll make them look like fools, retards, who just made up illogical, arguments and illogical, and chose illogical conclusions without any logical sense to it. It'll make them look like fools in front of their colleagues and friends. Who wants to look like fools in front of your colleagues and friends? So they will always have a defensive mechanism, a defensive stance to someone who brings proof to them, no matter how logical the proof is, because they didn't come to being an atheist, using logic. Not only would they not be capable of, understanding you logically, the moment they even think that you're telling the truth, they will try to insult you. They'll try to kick, they'll try to make you look like you're the crazy person. That way you don't, your logical arguments do not stand out. Your logical arguments do not make them look like fools. No one wants to look like fools in front of their friends. Because of that, they will never accept proof that, any logical proof you bring to them, they will never accept it publicly. Because it goes against everything about them. It makes them look like fools in front of others, and their ego cannot handle that. Some people may even try to kill you if if they can't stop you from proving that they're fools, right? If they can't stop you from proving that they're fools, they'll try to harm you. So that's what you have to be careful of when it comes to debating atheists, is that not only did they come to your conclusion illogically, they will try to harm you, or they'll try to, bury your truth or your logic using illogical arguments or violence. So, think things through if you ever want to debate or question atheists, because atheists will never use anything logical to counter your arguments. They will either mock you or insult you. And if you ask them for proof why they're atheists, they will never be able to give you proof, because it's impossible to be an atheist using any logical means. You can only be an atheist, illogically. So that's it for today's podcast episode. Next, the future podcast may be different from this one. So I don't really like talking about, religion to begin with. So I try to stay away from religion. That's what I've been doing my whole life. Not because, I hate religion and all that, but I just feel like the whole atheism, theism, atheism will never listen to you. They became, atheists simply because they follow others. They follow the scientists that they've known, they follow the people, in their lives that, that were atheists. So they became atheists because other people were atheists, and that's pretty much the only reason. So trying to debate an atheist is, just foolish. You'll never get anything out of it other than the fact that, you'll feel used, because they make no real logical arguments, but they can easily mock you. And if you're someone who, whose logic isn't all there, they can just constantly mock you and insult your logic. And if you have any illogical statements, they'll highlight it and they'll insult you endlessly over it, while hiding their own illogical arguments. They love pointing out your flaws, but the moment you point out their flaws, they try to hide it. They try to insult you even more over it. You do not point out the flaws of an atheist. Of the logic of an atheist. They don't like looking like fools in front of others. They don't like looking like fools in front of others. So, this is the problem with life in general. So it's best to just stay away from all this, all the drama. I don't really like drama that much. So you don't expect me to be debating anyone in the future. I don't do debates. I don't care about debates. If you don't believe in God, good for you. I know it's a lie, but, since I don't really believe you don't believe in God, it's impossible for you to actually bait me into a debate. because I don't believe you don't believe in God to begin with. So, that's pretty much all I can say to atheists. I don't really, it doesn't cross my mind that you're not a theist. You can pretend to be an atheist all day, but at the end of the day, the fact that most people in this world are theists, automatically, infers that you're probably a theist as well. If most people are humans, it infers that people who look like humans on planet Earth, are probably humans as well. If most people are theists, it infers that you're probably a theist pretending to be an atheist, because it's illogical to be an atheist to begin with. Well, that's it for today's podcast episode. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.